Before this horror story begins, a quick message. Forests are disappearing every day. That's why we created the Protect Our Forests t-shirt. Simple, stylish, and it carries a powerful message. Protect nature. Protect our future. Check the link in the description. Now, turn off the lights, sit back, and let the horror begin. Story 1. The Whisperer in the Willows. It started with the dog. That's how these things always start, isn't it? With the animals. They know before we do. They sense the shift in the atmosphere, the wrongness that hasn't yet taken shape. My name is Leo, and 3 years ago, my wife, Chloe, and I bought our dream home. It was a fixer-upper, a beautiful old Victorian on the outskirts of a sleepy town called Ridgemont Falls. The selling point, for us, wasn't the stained glass windows or the wraparound porch. It was the backyard. It was massive, a sprawling acre of emerald grass that butted right up against a dense, whispering wood. And in the center of that perfect lawn, stood a giant weeping willow, its long, graceful tendrils sweeping the ground like the hair of a mournful giant. We bought it in the fall, and the willow was a cascade of gold. We were blissfully ignorant. Our dog, a golden retriever we'd had since a puppy named Barley, loved that yard. He'd spend hours patrolling the fence line, chasing squirrels, and napping in the dappled shade of the willow. He was a happy, simple soul. The first sign came about a month after we moved in. It was a Tuesday night. Around 2 a.m. I was jolted awake by a sound I'd never heard from him before. It wasn't a bark. It was a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate up from the very core of his being, mixed with a high-pitched, keening whine. He was standing at the foot of the bed, facing the window that overlooked the backyard. His hackles were up, a stiff ridge of fur along his spine, and his whole body was trembling. I whispered his name, Barley. "Hey, buddy, what is it?" He didn't even look at me. His eyes were fixed on the darkness outside. I got up, my heart thumping a little faster than I'd care to admit, and peered out the window. The yard was bathed in silver moonlight. The willow stood there, perfectly still. There was nothing, no animal, no person, just the grass and the tree. But as I watched, a single, long tendril of the willow swayed. There was no wind. I told myself it was a stray breeze, a dying breath from a passing front. I told Barley he was a good boy, gave him a treat, and we both went back to bed. But he didn't sleep. He stayed at the foot of the bed, watching the window until dawn. After that, it became a ritual. Every night, around the same time, Barley would start his vigil. He'd whine and stare out at the willow. We took him to the vet, convinced he was developing anxiety or dementia. The vet found nothing wrong. "Dogs are sensitive," he'd said, with a shrug. "Maybe he sees a deer or a raccoon that you don't." Then the whispering started. It was a week later. I was working late in our home office, which was on the ground floor, at the back of the house. The window was cracked open a few inches to let in the cool autumn air. It was around 1 a.m. I was deep in a spreadsheet when I heard it. A voice. It was faint, barely there, like the rustle of dry leaves skittering across pavement. It was coming from outside, from the direction of the yard. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I strained to hear. It wasn't words, not exactly. It was more like a susurrus, a soft, rhythmic whispering, like someone trying to soothe a crying baby, but the tone was all wrong. It was empty, hollow. It would rise and fall, but held no warmth, no humanity. I slammed the window shut, my heart hammering against my ribs. I told myself it was the wind through the willow. Weeping willows are known for their whispers. It was a natural phenomenon. I went to bed and didn't tell Chloe. I didn't want to scare her, but I started paying more attention. I'd sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the willow. I noticed that on perfectly still nights, when the air was dead and the rest of the trees in the wood were motionless statues, the willow moved. Its long, whip-like branches would twitch and sway, as if animated by an unseen hand. And sometimes, if I sat there long enough, I'd hear the whisper. Just the faintest breath of sound on the air. Barley got worse. He refused to go into the backyard after sunset. We'd have to physically drag him out for his last bathroom break, and he'd do his business as fast as he could. His tail tucked so far between his legs it almost disappeared, his eyes darting nervously toward the willow. He stopped eating. He stopped playing. He just moped around the house, a ghost of his former joyful self. One night, I made a terrible mistake. I left the back door unlocked. I'd gone out to the garage to get something and forgot to bolt it when I came back in. I woke up at 3 a.m. to an unfamiliar silence. I looked at the foot of the bed. Barley wasn't there. A cold dread washed over me. "Chloe," I whispered, shaking her awake. "Barley's gone." We searched the house, our voices growing more panicked. Then I saw it. The back door was slightly ajar, swinging in the breeze. My blood turned to ice. I grabbed a flashlight and ran outside, screaming his name. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, frantically sweeping the yard. It wasn't until I aimed it at the willow that I stopped. There, in the deep shadow beneath its cascading canopy, I saw Barley. He was sitting perfectly still, facing the thick trunk of the tree. He wasn't moving. He wasn't making a sound. "Barley," I shouted, my voice cracking. "Barley, come here." He didn't respond. I ran towards him, my feet slipping on the dew-wet grass. As I got closer, I could hear it. The whispering. It was louder now, a frantic, urgent hiss that seemed to come from all around me, from the rustling branches above. I dove under the willow's curtain. The sight that greeted me will be seared into my memory until the day I die. Barley was on his feet, but his head was tilted all the way back, looking straight up into the dense, interwoven mass of branches. His mouth was slightly open, and a thin line of drool dripped from his jowls. But it was his eyes that got me. They were wide, staring, but utterly blank, vacant, as if the light behind them had simply been switched off. He was breathing, but he wasn't there anymore. I grabbed his collar and pulled. He didn't resist, but his body was stiff, his legs rigid. I dragged him out from under that tree, and the moment we were clear of its shadow, he collapsed. He let out a long, shuddering sigh, and his eyes fluttered closed. I carried his limp body back to the house. He was alive, but barely. We rushed him to the emergency vet. They couldn't find a physical cause. No poison, no injury. They kept him on fluids overnight, and by morning, he was physically stable. But mentally, he was broken. He wouldn't look out windows. He flinched at sudden noises. He spent his days hiding in his crate in the darkest corner of the basement. The vet, a kind woman with tired eyes, told us that sometimes animals just break. Something scares them so profoundly that they never recover. I, on the other hand, was filled with a burning rage. Something had done this to my dog. Something in my backyard. I became obsessed. I researched the history of the property. It took weeks of digging through old newspaper archives and county records. What I found chilled me to the bone. In the late 1800s, the land where my house stood was a farm owned by a man named Silas Blackwood. He had a young daughter, a little girl named Eliza. According to a tragic news story from 1887, little Eliza went missing from the farm. They searched for days. They finally found her, not in the woods, but in the backyard, beneath the branches of a young weeping willow her father had planted the year she was born. She was dead. The coroner ruled it was exposure. They said she must have gotten lost in the yard during a cold snap and succumbed to the elements, just yards from her back door. But the way the article was written, the way it mentioned the peaceful, almost serene, expression on her face, and how she was found sitting with her back against the trunk, staring up into the branches, it made my skin crawl. I now knew what lurked in my willow. It wasn't a ghost, not in the traditional sense. It was a hunger, a lonely, patient hunger that had waited over a century to find another playmate. It couldn't come into the house, but it could call out. It could whisper, and it had been whispering to us, to Barley, since the day we moved in. Chloe wanted to move. She begged me, but I couldn't. Not yet. Not without doing something. I was a coward, you see. I wasn't going to confront it. I was going to destroy it. The next weekend, I bought a chainsaw. Chloe was at her sister's place. She couldn't stand to be in the house anymore. I told her I was going to deal with it. I didn't tell her how. As dusk fell, I stood at the edge of the yard, the chainsaw heavy in my hands. The willow stood silhouetted against the bruised purple sky. For the first time, it didn't look sad or mournful. It looked menacing, a dark, alien shape against the fading light. I started the chainsaw. The roar shattered the evening peace. I marched toward it, my heart a drum of adrenaline and fear. As I got closer, the whispering started. It wasn't a faint rustle this time. It was a chorus, 1,000 tiny voices hissing and spitting, rising in pitch and volume, a frantic, desperate wail that seemed to come from the very air around me. The branches of the willow began to thrash violently, whipping through the air, even though there was not a breath of wind. It was like the tree itself was screaming. I raised the chainsaw, the blade glinting in the twilight, and took a swing at the main trunk. The wood was soft, almost rotten, and the saw bit deep. A shower of dark, wet sawdust sprayed my face. It smelled not of fresh wood, but of decay, of damp earth and something else. Something sweet and foul, like old flowers left to rot in a vase. The whispering turned into a shriek, a piercing, inhuman sound that drilled into my ears and made my vision swim. I ignored it. I pulled the saw back and swung again. And again. With each cut, the air grew colder. My breath began to mist in front of my face. The thrashing branches whipped at my back, stinging like angry snakes, but I didn't stop. Finally, with a groan that sounded like the death cry of a living thing, the great willow began to tilt. It fell slowly at first, then with a terrifying rush, crashing to the ground in an explosion of leaves and dirt. The shrieking stopped instantly. The air went dead calm. The oppressive cold vanished, replaced by the cool, clean air of a normal autumn night. I stood there, panting, covered in sweat and sawdust, the now silent chainsaw dangling from my hand. I had done it. I had killed the thing that had hurt my dog, that had haunted our home. I expected to feel triumphant. I expected peace, but as I stood there in the sudden, profound silence, looking at the fallen giant, I felt nothing but a deep, gnawing unease. It had been too easy. The whispers, the thrashing, it had felt like a tantrum, not a final stand. Like it was scared, but not of me. Like it was scared of what was coming next. I turned to walk back to the house, and that's when I saw it. At the base of where the willow had stood, now exposed to the open air, was a hole in the ground. It wasn't a root cavity. It was a perfect, circular hole, about 2 feet wide, descending into blackness. It looked almost man-made, lined with old, crumbling stones. An old well, the well little Eliza Blackwood must have fallen into over a century ago. The tree had been planted right over its mouth. As I stared into that perfect circle of darkness, a new sound emerged from its depths. It wasn't a whisper. It was a single, clear voice. The voice of a little girl, sweet and high, echoing up from the earth. "Thank you for letting me out," it sang. "I was down here for so long." I turned and ran, not stopping until I was inside the house with every single lock bolted and every light blazing. I called Chloe and told her to stay at her sister's. I told her we were selling the house. We did. We sold it at a massive loss to a developer who planned to bulldoze the whole property and build a subdivision. We moved 3 states away. Barley slowly, over the course of a year, returned to his old self. He's sleeping at my feet as I type this. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet, I hear it. A faint, sweet whispering, coming from my own backyard. And when I look out the window, I see the new willow tree the previous owner planted. Its long, graceful tendrils are swaying gently in the breeze. But there is no wind. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to my core, that it wasn't the tree that was the prison. The tree was just the lid. And I, in my arrogance and rage, took the lid off. The whisperer isn't in the willows anymore. It's free, and it's looking for a new playmate. Story 2. The Offering. My name is Sam, and I'm an archaeologist. Or at least, I was. My specialty is pre-Columbian cultures of North America. I've spent my life studying the mound builders, the ancient ones who left behind giant earthworks and a legacy shrouded in mystery. So when my wife, Julia, and I bought our first home, a charming ranch-style house on a wooded lot in southern Ohio, I thought I knew everything there was to know about the land's history. I was wrong, so terribly wrong. The house itself was unremarkable. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, a nice big kitchen. The real appeal was the property. It sat on 5 acres of dense woodland, with a small, spring-fed creek running through the back. It was private, peaceful, and perfect. The realtor, an older local guy named Earl, was a little too eager to close the deal. He glossed over the history of the plot, just saying it had been farmland for generations before being subdivided. I, the great archaeologist, didn't think to dig deeper. I was too enamored with the thought of having my own private woods to explore. Our first summer there was idyllic. We'd have bonfires in the fire pit I built near the creek. We'd go for hikes on the weekends, following deer trails through the forest. It was during one of those hikes, about 3 months after we moved in, that I found it. I was following the creek upstream, looking for a good fishing spot, when I noticed a subtle rise in the terrain. A perfectly rounded hillock that seemed out of place among the flatter floodplain. It was covered in mature trees, their roots gripping the slope. But it was the shape that caught my eye. It was too symmetrical, too deliberate. I climbed to the top, my professional curiosity piqued. From the summit, I could see a pattern in the land below, a faint, almost imperceptible depression that encircled the base of the hill. My heart started to race. It was a mound, an ancient, untouched, conical mound, right in my own backyard. For the next few weeks, I was in archaeologist heaven. I surveyed the site, took meticulous notes, and photographed everything from every angle. I kept it a secret from Julia at first. I wanted to be sure. But one evening, I couldn't contain my excitement. I told her about my discovery, my voice trembling with the thrill of it. She was fascinated. So, what's inside? Bones? Treasure? She asked, her eyes wide. Probably not treasure in the way you think, I explained. But artifacts, pottery, tools, maybe burial goods. It's a direct link to people who lived here 1,000 years ago. It's sacred ground, Julia. The word, sacred, should have given me pause. It didn't. My initial plan was to just document it. Leave it untouched. That's the ethical thing to do. But as the weeks turned into months, the temptation grew unbearable. I'd sit on our back porch, staring at the mound, and my imagination would run wild. What secrets did it hold? What stories were buried in that earth? The professional in me fought a losing battle against the treasure hunter. I convinced myself that it was better for me to excavate it properly than for some looters to find it. I told Julia I was going to do a small, careful test excavation. Just a trench to confirm its origin. She, trusting me implicitly, agreed. I started on a crisp Saturday morning in October. I chose a spot on the eastern slope, away from the largest trees. I dug slowly, carefully, sifting every shovelful of dirt through a screen. For the first few feet, it was just dark, rich topsoil. Then, about 3 feet down, my trowel hit something hard. I switched to a brush, my hands shaking with anticipation. It was a bone, a human finger bone. I should have stopped. Any ethical archaeologist would have. This was a burial. It was a grave. But I was no longer an archaeologist in that moment. I was a grave robber, driven by a perverse curiosity. I dug deeper, faster, my movements becoming less careful, more frantic. I unearthed more bones, fingers, ribs, vertebrae. They were old, fragile, stained dark brown by the soil. And then I found the skull. It was unlike anything I had ever seen. It was human, yes, but the shape was wrong. The cranium was elongated, almost conical, a result of deliberate head binding practiced by some ancient cultures. But it was the expression frozen on its face that truly terrified me. The jaw was wide open, locked in a silent, eternal scream. This wasn't a peaceful burial. This was a man who had died in abject terror. As I stared into that gaping mouth, I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The air around me grew cold, heavy, and still. The cheerful birdsong of the morning had ceased. The woods were dead silent. I scrambled back from the hole, my heart pounding. I had disturbed something that was not meant to be disturbed. I covered the bones as best I could with a tarp and ran back to the house. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay there, listening to the wind in the trees, jumping at every creak and groan of the house. I told Julia everything the next morning. To my surprise, she wasn't angry. She was just worried. She suggested we call a university, hand it over to the professionals. I agreed. It was the right thing to do. But we never got the chance. That night, the dreams started. In the dream, I was standing in the woods, but it wasn't my woods. It was older, wilder. The trees were taller, the undergrowth thicker. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man, but not quite. He was tall and gaunt, his skin the color of old ash. His head was elongated, just like the skull in the mound, and his eyes were black, bottomless pits. He didn't speak, he just stared at me with that silent, screaming mouth. And then he raised a hand, long-fingered and skeletal, and pointed a single, bony finger at me. The gesture was clear. You did this, now you owe me. I woke up with a jolt, drenched in sweat. The room was freezing cold. I looked over at Julia, who was sleeping soundly. On her nightstand, the digital clock flashed 3 a.m. 3 a.m. The witching hour. I tried to shake off the nightmare, to tell myself it was just my guilty conscience manifesting itself. But as I lay there, I heard it. A faint sound from the backyard. A rhythmic thumping. Thump, thump, thump. I crept to the window and peered out. The backyard was bathed in moonlight. My heart nearly stopped. At the edge of the woods, near the mound, stood the figure from my dream. The ashen man with the cone head. He was holding a long, wooden staff, and with it, he was slowly, deliberately, beating the ground. Thump, thump, thump. He wasn't looking at the house. He was looking at the spot where I had dug my trench. He was marking it. I didn't wake Julia. What would I have said? I just watched, frozen, until the figure dissolved into the darkness of the trees as the first hint of dawn touched the sky. The next night, the thumping was closer. It was coming from the edge of the lawn. The figure was there again, just standing at the tree line, beating the earth with his staff. This time, I could see that the staff wasn't a staff. It was a human leg bone. And on his other hand, the fingers were no longer just long. They were tipped with what looked like claws. He was closer. The dreams intensified. In them, the ashen man would lead me on a procession through the woods. Behind him, I could see other figures, shadowy and indistinct, their heads also elongated, their mouths also open in silent screams. They were his people, his kin. They had been waiting for something. For an offering. I became a shell of myself. I stopped working. I stopped eating. I spent my days researching, frantically, desperately, trying to find out who or what I had awakened. I found references in obscure anthropological journals to a legend among the local Native American tribes. A story of a malevolent shaman, a whisperer of the dead, who was so evil, so feared, that when he died, his own people didn't just bury him. They built a mound over him, a prison of earth, and they planted a specific type of tree on top to bind his spirit. The tree was a barrier, a lock, and if the lock was ever broken, the shaman would rise again to claim a sacrifice to restore his power. I had removed the lock. I had opened the prison. The thumping came every night, moving closer and closer. One night it was at the edge of the patio. The next, it was at the back door. I'd hear the heavy, wet thud of that bone staff on the wooden deck. I'd see his gaunt, ashen face pressed against the window, his black, pitiless eyes scanning the room. He was looking for something. For someone. Julia finally saw him on the 5th night. She woke me with a scream that I will never forget. He was in our bedroom, standing at the foot of our bed, just as the ancient, screaming skull had lain at the bottom of its hole. His lipless mouth was stretched wide in that same eternal howl. He was holding the leg bone, and he was pointing it at Julia. The message was clear, an offering. He wanted an offering. I knew then what I had to do. I couldn't let him take her. I was the one who had disturbed him. I was the one who owed the debt. The next day, while Julia was at work, I went back to the mound. The tarp was gone, blown away by the wind. The bones lay exposed in the bottom of the trench, but they weren't the same. They were wrong. They were fresh. The dark stain on them looked less like age and more like blood. And the skull, with its gaping mouth, seemed to be staring right at me, its empty eye sockets filled with a malevolent knowing. I went back to the house and got a shovel. As dusk fell, I went to the mound one last time. I stood at the edge of the trench, looking down at the horror I had unleashed. Then, I did the only thing I could think of. I climbed down into the grave. The earth was cold, unnaturally cold, and it seemed to pulse with a faint, sickening life. I lay down in the trench, on my back, right next to the screaming skull. I stared up at the darkening sky, the same view the shaman must have had over 1,000 years ago when they covered him with dirt. I don't know if it was my imagination, but I felt a shift. A pressure. The air grew heavy, and the thumping sound, which had become a constant, maddening presence, stopped. In its place, I heard a whisper, dry as dust, that seemed to come from the very soil around me. Accepted. Then the world went black. I woke up in a hospital bed 3 days later. A hiker had found me unconscious in the woods, lying in a shallow depression, covered in leaves. There was no trench, no bones, no skull. The ground was smooth and undisturbed, as if I had never dug at all. The ashen man was gone. The thumping had ceased. Julia was by my side, her face streaked with tears. She told me I'd been missing for 2 days. She said I walked out of the house the night after she saw the figure, and just vanished into the woods. She was terrified she'd never see me again. I was discharged a week later, physically fine. But I'm not fine. I can't go near wooded areas anymore. The sight of a rounded hill makes me break out in a cold sweat. I still have the dreams, but they've changed. Now, I'm not running from the Ashen Man. I am the Ashen Man. I stand at the edge of someone else's woods, holding a bone staff, my mouth stretched wide in a silent scream. I am waiting. I paid the debt. I offered myself. I took his place in the prison. But the prison isn't a mound of earth anymore. It's this, my life, a life haunted by the knowledge that I am the keeper of a secret, the vessel for something ancient and evil. I am the whisperer of the dead now, and I'm waiting for someone else to make a terrible mistake. I'm waiting for someone else to dig where they shouldn't. I'm waiting for my own offering to be released, and when they do, I'll be waiting for them, at the edge of their woods, with my bone staff, ready to pass on the curse. Story 3. The Hole. My name is Dan, and I learned that some doors should never be opened. Some mysteries should remain buried. This is the story of the hole in my backyard. It wasn't a sinkhole. It wasn't an old well. It was something else entirely. Something that shouldn't exist. It started with a patch of dead grass. We'd had a brutal summer, a record-breaking drought, and our lawn was a crispy, yellow mess. But this patch, about 3 feet in diameter near the back fence, was different. It wasn't just dead, it was black. The grass wasn't brown. It was a brittle, charcoal-colored stubble that crumbled to dust if you touched it. The soil beneath it was dry, but not with the dryness of the rest of the yard. It was desiccated, powdery, like ash. My wife, Sarah, thought it was a chemical spill from the previous owners. My daughter, Lily, who was 7, thought it was where a witch had been burned. Kids have a way of cutting to the heart of things, don't they? I just thought it was weird. I tried everything to get grass to grow there. I watered it, fertilized it, even dug up the topsoil and replaced it with fresh sod. Within a week, the new sod was just as black and dead as the original patch. It was like the ground itself was poison. The hole appeared a month later. It was small at first, just a tiny indentation in the center of the dead patch, no bigger than a quarter. I figured it was a gopher hole or a vole, but it grew. Every day, it was a little wider, a little deeper. It didn't cave in. It was a perfect circle, as if the earth was simply vanishing into nothingness. Within 2 weeks, it was the size of a dinner plate and so dark I couldn't see the bottom. I shone a powerful flashlight into it. The beam just stopped. It didn't illuminate any walls or a bottom. It was absorbed by the blackness. It was like looking into a hole that went on forever. That's when the strange feeling started. A feeling of being watched. It was strongest when I was near the hole. The back of my neck would prickle, and I'd get a sudden, overwhelming urge to run back to the house. Sarah felt it too. She stopped going into the backyard altogether. She said the air around the hole felt heavy and sad. Lily, though, Lily was fascinated. She'd sit on the patio, staring at the hole for hours, a strange, thoughtful expression on her little face. "Don't go near it, honey," I'd warn her. "It's dangerous." "It's not dangerous, Daddy," she'd say, her voice calm and sure. "It's just listening." Her words chilled me more than any horror movie ever could. Listening? Listening to what? The sounds started about a week after Lily made that comment. At first, they were faint, barely audible. A low, rumbling hum that seemed to vibrate up through the soles of my feet. It was more a feeling than a sound. It would come and go, usually late at night. Then, the hum was joined by whispers. Not like the Willow story, not the susurrus of leaves. This was different. These were actual whispers, fragments of words in a language I'd never heard. They were guttural, sibilant, and they seemed to be coming from the hole itself, echoing up from its impossible depths. I tried to rationalize it. Underground water, I told myself. Geological shifts, but I knew I was lying to myself. The dead patch, the ever-expanding hole, the feeling of dread, the whispers, it was all connected. And it was all getting worse. One night, I was jolted awake by a scream. It was Sarah. She was sitting bolt upright in bed, her face pale as a ghost, her eyes wide with terror. It spoke to me, she whispered, her voice trembling. I was dreaming, and I was standing at the edge of the hole. And a voice came out of it. It was cold and old, and it said, "Give her to me." My blood ran cold. Give her to me. Her. Lily. After that night, we kept Lily inside. We locked all the doors and windows. We tried to pretend the hole didn't exist. But it was always there, a dark, watchful presence in our backyard. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. The humming became a constant, low thrum that vibrated through the entire house, making the pictures on the walls tilt slightly and the glasses in the cupboard clink together softly. Lily started talking to it. I'd catch her sitting by the back door, her lips moving, as if she were having a conversation with someone just outside. When I asked her who she was talking to, she'd just smile and say, "My friend. The one in the hole." My fear turned to a desperate, primal panic. I had to do something. I couldn't call the police. What would I say? "Officer, there's a supernatural hole in my yard that wants my daughter." I had to destroy it. I had to fill it. The next day, I waited until Sarah took Lily to her mother's house for the afternoon. Then, I went to the garage and got a bag of quick dry concrete mix and a shovel. I was going to fill that abomination and seal it forever. I walked to the edge of the hole. It was bigger than ever, now about 3 feet across. The darkness inside was so absolute it felt like a physical presence, like I was staring into the eye of a nightmare. The whispers stopped the moment I approached. The humming ceased. The air became deathly still. It was waiting, watching. I didn't care. I ripped open the bag of concrete and started pouring it into the hole. The gray powder vanished into the darkness. I poured another bag, and another. I must have poured 10 bags of concrete into that hole, and the darkness never wavered. It never filled up. It just swallowed the concrete as if it were nothing. I stood there, panting, covered in cement dust, a sense of utter hopelessness washing over me. It was no use. You can't fill nothing. You can't seal a wound in the universe with concrete. As I stood there, defeated, a new sound came from the hole. Not a whisper this time. It was a clear, sweet voice. My daughter's voice. "Daddy," it called from the darkness. "Daddy, it's dark in here. Can you come and get me?" My heart stopped. I knew it wasn't her. She was safe at her grandmother's. But the voice was so perfect, so convincing, so full of the exact inflection of her fear, that I took an involuntary step forward. My foot was inches from the edge of the hole when I stopped myself. I looked down into that perfect blackness, and for a fraction of a second, I saw something. Not a face, not a form. Just a suggestion of movement, a shifting in the darkness itself. And I felt its hunger. It was a ravenous, ancient, endless hunger. And it had almost tricked me into walking right into its mouth. I stumbled backward, turned, and ran into the house. I called Sarah and screamed at her to stay at her mother's, to not come home, to keep Lily away. I told her I loved her and hung up. Then I sat in the living room, in the dark, and watched the hole through the window. That was 3 years ago. I'm still here. Sarah left me, of course. She took Lily and moved across the country to live with her sister. She thinks I had a psychotic break. Maybe I did, but I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I stayed because I have to. Someone has to watch it. Someone has to make sure it doesn't get any bigger. I built a tall, sturdy fence around the dead patch, but it doesn't help. The hole is still there, a perfect circle of infinite nothing in the center of my yard. The dead patch has spread. It's now a barren, ashen circle 50 feet in diameter. The grass for yards around is brown and dying. The whispers are constant now, a low, muttering chorus that never stops. It talks to me. It whispers my name. It whispers my daughter's name. It promises me things. It threatens me. But the worst part, the part that keeps me awake every single night, is what I saw last week. I was watching the hole, as I always do, when I saw a flicker of movement at its edge. I grabbed my binoculars and focused. It was a hand, a small, pale hand, gripping the lip of the hole from the inside. It was the hand of a child. For a moment, I felt a surge of impossible hope. Lily, had it brought her back? But then the hand began to pull, and a face started to emerge from the darkness. It wasn't Lily. It had her blonde hair, but the face was wrong. It was a grotesque parody of her features. The eyes too wide, the smile too big, stretching from ear to ear, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. It looked at me, right at me, with those impossibly wide eyes, and it spoke in my daughter's sweet, loving voice. "Don't worry, Daddy," it said. "I'll wait. I'm very patient, and one day, she'll come back to visit. And when she does, I'll be here. And I'll ask her to come and play. I haven't slept since. I sit here, in this decaying house, surrounded by a dead zone of my own making, watching the hole. It's waiting, and I know, with a certainty that is slowly driving me mad, that my vigil will not last forever. One day, I'll slip. One day, I'll fall asleep. And on that day, it will crawl out. And it will go looking for my little girl. I can't stop it. I can only watch. I am the guardian of the hole. And I am terrified of the day my guard finally drops. Subscribe for next video. Thanks.